Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in the Bill James Room, presented by the Action Network. My name is Dan Stavens. I'm a first-year MBA at MIT Sloan. It's my honor today to introduce our panel, On Deck with Rob Manfred. Our panelists, Rob Manfred, Commissioner of Major League Baseball. The panel will be moderated by Carl Ravitch, host of ESPN and Baseball Tonight. This panel will run for 40 minutes, with 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you'd like to submit any questions, you can do so on Twitter using our hashtag MLB Commish. Then the moderator then selects your questions accordingly based on the top mentions. And with that, I'll hand it over to Carl.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it is interesting. I know both Rob and I were in here when the previous speaker was up here. And
thinned out a little bit.
Somebody's got to follow Stanton in the lineup. That's one way to look at it. Or, you know, when the elephants march in, somebody's got to follow the elephant with a little shovel. So we're one of the other. I don't know, but this is right in your wheelhouse. We got a clock.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
We got a 39-minute pace of play thing going here. All right, so, and just welcome. It's a pleasure to share the stage with you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here. You know, I was here a few years ago, enjoyed it, and I'm glad to be back.
Good to have you here. All right, so I have 4 subjects that we'd like to get into.
Okay.
And you can decide. I'll let you dictate what order we go in. We have pace of play, we have role of technology, future of free agency, new generation of fans, and I'll add a potluck, which will be off the top of my head.
Okay, let's do them in order. That's fine. Let's start with pace
of play. Let's start with pace of play. So the question or the theory is, as America's pastime, baseball has held a similar place for almost a century. Why do you, and you sort of be a driver here, why do you think it's only recently that there's been this pressure, and whether it's from you or from the fans, to increase the pace of play?
Well, I think, you know, when you're here, always a good answer is it's about analytics. You know, pace of play, we didn't wake up one morning and realize that, gee, you know, we ought to be focused on pace of play. 2 things happened. Paid a lot of attention to our game. We developed a lot of metrics about what was actually going on the field, how much action we have, how much time we have where there's not a lot of action, the length of our game, and all of those analytics suggested that we had an issue with respect to how much action there was in the game and how much dead time there was in the game. Secondly, we are research-driven in terms of big policy issues like this. We went and did an extensive amount of research with our avid fans, our casual fans. The number one thing both avid and casual fans want to change about the game is the speed of the game, the pace of the game. Just in case we weren't right in our research, we also talked to our broadcast partners, ESPN included, who do their own research, and their research shows exactly the same thing. So, you know, it's important to remember there's a lot of constituencies involved in the game. Players are obviously an important one. The owners are an important one. But at the end of the day, the engine of Major League Baseball gets driven by our fans. And that's where we should be fundamentally responsive.
Is that, 2 things off of that, is that a big challenge? To understand or to get other people to understand, if we're just shuffling the seats on the Titanic and the Titanic sinks, there's nobody there to watch it. Is it hard to get them to understand that theory?
I think there's a fundamental understanding among owners for sure, because they see it every day in terms of how their business does. But I think players as well. They understand that you know, fans have to be first, and that we have to be responsive to what our fans expect and deserve from our game in terms of the quality of the entertainment product. You know, it's also important to put pace of game in a broader context than just baseball. All sports have been addressing these pace issues. You know, football's made some changes, basketball's made some changes, and I think it's a validation of the idea that we're living in a society where it demands crispness, action in order to be a really top flight entertainment product.
How do you distinguish between pace of play and time of game? Why is there a line there?
Well, time of game is largely determined by things that we wouldn't presume to be able to control. The most obvious of which is how much offense occurs in a game. How many pitches get thrown. We can't regulate those two things. Literally, if you know whether it's raining or not, how many runs get scored, and how many pitches get thrown, you can predict very, very accurately how long the game is going to be. And you can't control any of those three things. So we don't worry so much about time. What we worry about is the spots in the game where nothing is happening on the field that really is of interest to the fans in the ballpark and the fans in our broadcast audience. And I mean, it is important to think about those two groups separately. Pace is much less of an issue for fans in the ballpark because there's other things to do. That time gets filled, right? Mm-hmm. With the obvious sort of entertainment, non-baseball entertainment that goes on in the ballpark. It is, and the research supports this as well, a bigger issue with the broadcast audience.
Right. Now, research shows that the entertainment industry, particularly the film industry, has discovered that movies that run 120 minutes are more, seem to be more attended and appealing than the ones that run 220 minutes. You know, they don't make many Gone with the Winds anymore.
Right.
Is there anything that you could do to control the time of game?
Yeah, look, I think that the best that we can do in this wave of reform is to deal with the dead time issue. There's enough dead time in the game that I think over the length of the season, if you deal with it correctly, you will see shorter games.
Is there another wave of reform out there that I'm not aware of?
Well, there's things that people have talked about that we have not entertained seriously at this point because they move beyond, you know, the things that fall conceptually under the heading of you know dead time or lack of action in the game into things that actually affect the competition on the field. You've seen people talk about limitations on the use of relief pitchers. Well, that's a much bigger change. I mean, it can affect obviously the outcome of individual games, but you know it actually affects the strategies, longer-term strategies of individual teams, right? People have gone out, they've decided that, you know, they want to build their club from the ninth inning backwards. You make a bunch of changes that limits the ability to use those players that you've developed and or acquired. That's a really big fundamental change in the game, and we've shied away from those so far.
What's the difference, if there's any, between the player's perception of the pace of game and maybe the fans' perception, given that you do interact with a lot of players?
You know, it's interesting. If you read, and I do try to read and listen to players, have, you know, individual conversations with them, I think most people realize we have a pace of game problem. Where and if you actually read the articles, you know, we acknowledge we need to play faster, that we need less dead time in the game. Where you kind of lose them is in the specific changes that you're advocating at any particular point in time. And you know, that's natural. You think about it, major league players, they work very hard for a long period of time. They reach the pinnacle of their profession. And you say, now all of a sudden this guy in New York's telling me I have to pitch in 20 seconds instead of 26 seconds. You can see where that would cause some pause among players.
Yeah, it's funny, having worked with so many players who then obviously become former players, their perception of the pace of play and or length of game and or number of innings per game seems to change dramatically when they're not in uniform. I mean, you wouldn't believe the people I sit with who say, my God, let's move. And I'm not one of those. I mean, you and I both know that concept of, I think the game isn't broken. You could conceivably change the number of innings that are played per game.
Well, I think there's two truisms in there that, you know, it's much easier to tolerate change when that change is no longer directly affecting your career, right? I mean, it just, I mean, that's human nature. And, but I think that it's important to emphasize when we're talking about making adjustments to a gem, right? Our game is a great game. People love our game. One of the reasons that you get strong reaction when you suggest making changes to the game is because people are so invested.
Passionate.
Yeah, about our sport. And, you know, on the one hand, we like the idea of being open-minded, candid, willing to discuss change. On the other hand, you don't want that willingness to talk about issues to somehow suggest that we think there's something fundamentally wrong with the game, because we don't. Quite to the contrary, we think the game's great.
Yeah, there is that feeling. If we're always trying to fix it, does that mean it's broken? When in fact it really is not broken.
And there's a, you know, there's a line there between doing nothing, right, and, you know, creating this perception that you think it's broken. I prefer to think of it this way. Look, all sports, and, you know, this is really clear and I think instructive. All sports have managed change in their game. We don't think so much about how are we going to change the game. What we think we're doing is we're thinking about how should we manage change that's taking place organically. I mean, if you just look quantitatively at a baseball game from 25 years ago, on every measure, how long it is, how many pitches get thrown, how often somebody puts a ball in play, how many times a batter swings at a first pitch, how many strikeouts there are in the game, how many home runs, all those things are dramatically different from a quantitative perspective. So it's not a question of, are you changing the game? It's a question, are you going to manage the change that's taking place organically? And I think that question becomes easy when you realize that the organic change is literally being driven by 30 independent organizations who are really interested in one thing, right? Can I win 2 more games this year? That is not a long-term perspective for success of the industry as a whole and for preservation of baseball's role in American culture.
Yeah, you opened up a bunch of doors there to walk in. I'll go with the technology part of the game.
Right.
Many people will point to instant replay as something that slows the pace of the game down.
I've been dying for somebody to ask me about replay and pace of game. So here's the numbers, right? I mean, I've been dying for this for a week, and I've been out there a lot this week. You know, on average, we have 0.57 instant replays per game, okay? So less than 1 per game. The average replay from the time of the challenge to the time of decision takes 1 minute and 20 seconds. Over the course of our season, instant replay adds precisely 50 seconds to the length of the game. So, you know, look, replay was responsive to a fundamental fan desire for us to use the best available technology to get important calls right. If the price of that is adding 50 seconds to the game, I'm all in on that.
So why do you think the perception is so different?
You know, I think that people have seized on replay and the experience of replay across sports as a source of delay in the game. And, you know, I think, you know, I hearken back to, I was listening to President Obama, you know, people don't know what the facts are. You know, the debate goes on. People assert that replay is a problem, yet you don't hear anybody talk about those numbers that I just talked about. I think the second thing about replay, and it really gets to your point about technology, this year, for example, in addition to the rule changes that we've been talking about, we invested several $1 million to make sure that super slow motion feeds are available more quickly in the replay rooms in the individual stadiums. And I'll tell you, it's phenomenal. I used to play, I don't do it quite as often, but I used to play a game every morning. I would get all of the replays from the night before, the video clip, and I wouldn't look at the outcome, you know, whether it was overturned or not. I would try to do it myself. And so, like, the first year we had replay, like, out and safe at first base, I have to tell you, our umpires are phenomenal, because it's really hard. Without super slow motion, it is really hard, even when you can rewind the tape and look at it. As we went to super slow motion cameras, they're like that now. It's so much easier. And this is a way that, you know, you can attack how long something takes on the field other than through rule changes, and that's by using technology.
But I have heard from people, when you do see at home the super slow-mo, and it appears to be overly convincing what that call either should be or should be overturned to, there does seem to be perception, further delay of, oh wait, we just saw it. Like, we're done with this, and sometimes it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't happen that fast. You know, look, I think that there is such a thing as too much information. If you see the replay setup in New York, it's actually, we ought to make it a tourist attraction. People who go to see it actually love it. And, you know, there's a lot of information thrown at umpires. And look, our umpires are the consummate professionals. They really are. They care so much about getting it right in the first instance on the field, and it's even more serious when they're in the replay room, right? Because they feel like, I don't even have the excuse of time, right? I mean, I really have to make sure that I'm getting this right.
Do you still wake up and play that game?
I do it probably 2 or 3 times a week. I used to do it every day.
So you're growing, you're improving. Good.
Yeah, I'm
That's
getting
development.
You know what? It's not as hard. So, you know, you lose. It's not quite as hard as
this technology, and clearly this is a conference, this is a room really dedicated to, you know, analytics and the marriage of technology to it. You used to go to a baseball game and you would keep score. Now you go to a baseball game and you have a phone out. It seems most people are doing that. What's the balance between having that great experience from the past with this new experience of the present?
Well, look, I think that because baseball fans are all so attached to the history and traditions of the game, you're always going to have people who want to have that tactile experience of a scorecard and a pencil and keeping score. I think over time, however, you will see people move more and more into technology as a substitute for those more traditional forms of keeping track of the game. I mean, I think it's natural. And, you know, look, technology is going to drive every aspect of our business. Think about it, right? We just announced today a VR product, home run derby product, right? That's a brand new source of fan engagement, okay? The ballpark app, the app, our ballpark app will eventually affect everything that happens to the fan, from how he enters the ballpark, how he orders his food, whether he upgrades his or her seat, keeping track of events around the stadium. So again, technology there. Broadcast audience, 100% clear that you are going to see more innovation around the content that surrounds the game in broadcasts. StatCast was the last big one. That will not be the end of that line. There will be increasing uses of technology in that broadcast audience. And maybe most important, it's how the game gets played on the field. You know, it begins with the analytics that every club uses to put its team together. You know, I mean, it is phenomenal, the proprietary analytical material that each of the clubs has developed in order to aid themselves in that process. But it's not just putting the club together, it's in-game, right? Everybody knows what the situations are, how particular players should be used, what are the odds that that particular strategy is going to be successful, and there'll be more and more of that as we go forward.
But because of that, it almost feels, and I'm sure in your position, you have 30 team owners, you have all these players, you have these teams who are interested, as you say, winning. There's a variety of conflicting interests here that go into this. The Chicago Cubs are far more interested in playing the most efficient game for their sake to win than they are with time of game. So there's a lot of conflicting interests that go into this.
100%. I think the distinction that you always have to bear in mind is, clubs are one-trick ponies, really, when you think about it, okay? Owners don't invest in baseball teams to make profits year after year. I'm not saying that, their asset doesn't appreciate and at the end of the day it all works out. Our owners invest because they want to win, and so everything that those GMs do is directed at putting together a strategy that maximizes their opportunity to win at a particular point in time.
And that's sort of the caveat, at a particular point in time.
Right. Everybody's not going to win each and every year. I mean, every business has a cycle. People who sell particular products may realize that, my clothing line is at the end of its useful life. I'm going to go through a process where, I phase that one out and get a new one.
But the goal is always to be at the top, where in baseball and other sports, you apparently can't always live at the top.
Nobody lives. Well, it's impossible by definition. Not everybody is going to have a maximum level of competitiveness in every year. Somebody has got to lose, right? I mean, that's the reality. So I think that at the league level, in contrast to the winning motivation, our job is to try to look at the game more broadly, think about our fan base, be really cognizant of what the desires of those fans are, and try to make adjustments that are responsive to those fans.
And the distinction gotta lose because there's only one champion is different than accepting or trying to lose in order to become better. So given the we need to get really bad to get good theory out there, is there a way to address that so that fans in certain cities don't have to go through the period of time? Is there anything to do?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that it is possible to do things within our economic model that address some of the concerns that have been voiced. I mean, people have talked about things. We've actually proposed on a number of occasions, minimum club payrolls, minimum expenditures. And ironically, the response that we've gotten from the Players Association, which now loves this "you're not trying to win" theory, was, we don't want to inhibit clubs from going through their natural cycle of starting over with a young team. And if you're requiring a club to spend when they're at that point in the cycle, it's inefficient. I mean, that has been the historic, traditional back and forth at the collective bargaining table, going back, to the late 90s.
Because you've been in the room. You've heard it.
I have.
You've been in the room.
I have.
With regards to what's going on with free agency this year, clearly it's different. Mm-hmm. Is this a stage we're in? Is this the way it's going to be? It seems, I'm sure most of these people in the audience will tell you that the maximum age for player has changed, and as a result they should be getting paid when they're Alex Bregman's age and not necessarily J.D. Martinez's age.
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of things going on, some longer term, some shorter term related to this particular year. On the longer term front, I think that analytics have made clubs far better at valuing players. Just a truism. And it is also true that under our current system, a lot of players hit free agency at a point in time that they're closer to being in decline than in ascending performance. That's been going on for a while. I mean, if you look back over the last few years, you'll see that trend building.
It feels like we should change that.
Well, it may be that the efficient thing to do is what you alluded to before, make changes in your economic model where what a player earns is more closely related to his expected productivity, right?
Right.
The second thing, I think there are some shorter term things that went on. Look, we made big changes in the basic agreement the last time around. We did. I don't know. We certainly expected, and I'd be surprised if the players didn't realize, the Players Association, didn't realize that those changes were likely to have an effect on the free agent market. I mean, it is, we were bargaining for restraint. I mean, we're pretty public about that. And, Dan, this one I can't take credit for. It's Dan Hallam's deal, and he made a good deal. So I think the basic agreement is certainly part of what's going on. But in addition to those basic agreement changes, we had a little bit of a perfect storm, right? The basic agreement created an incentive for clubs that had been over the tax threshold to get under for 1 year because their tax rate going forward, right, was going to be lower. So both the Dodgers and the Yankees, two traditional drivers in our free agent market, had this incentive to get down. That incentive hit in a year where they had great young players and or managed to make additions through the trade market, right? So the incentive to get down was very high. Both clubs, I believe, felt they could be really, really competitive with the younger players that they had. And when they looked forward to the free agent market next year, what did they see? A very, very strong class. I mean, that's been written over and over and over again. So I think it's a combination of these longer term developments, bargaining changes, and just, the perfect storm of how those bargaining changes interacted with where some of the, traditionally important clubs in the free agent market happen to be in a given year.
Right, but I do worry, and I'm sure we have all these folks are baseball fans. As a fan, put the fan hat on for a second, is you guys, and you just acknowledged, we negotiated a good deal. When you negotiate a good deal, your next negotiation, you want to negotiate another good deal, but you do recognize that the way you negotiated this last deal probably puts the players at a position where they can't accept that deal again.
Well, look, I think that this is a very difficult collective bargaining agreement, right? You have to begin from that proposition. I mean, usually, and I bargained a lot in other industries, and it wasn't that hard on the economics. Somebody would say to you, you're going to increase this wage rate by 15 cents, it costs you X. I mean, it's precise. It has always been the case that because you're negotiating over how a market is going to operate. That's really what it's about. There's no set wages other than the minimum salary. You're negotiating about what's going to happen in a particular market. There has been a lot of examples where we got a deal, made a deal, where it didn't quite turn out the way we wanted it to turn out. Same thing on the union side. That's why collective bargaining agreements expire. That's why you have to negotiate renewals. And, 4 years from now, we'll be back at it. Look, there's always bumps in the road in a labor relationship. I think this is a bump in the road. We got 4 more free agent markets. Let's see what happens.
Right. Oh boy, we were really singing the harmony song, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, what happened here?
I said this in an interview the other day. We sort of feel like, you're standing talking to someone, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a fight, and you can't really quite figure out how you got there because you don't think you did anything. Look, we negotiated a deal. We did what our job was. We've lived up to every aspect of that deal. Each and every deal. Sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes another. 4 years, you get a chance to, do it all over again.
All right, I talked to a bunch of fans. I talked to executives telling them that I was about to do this. So here's a handful of Kind of rapid-fire questions you can get into deeply. Expansion. Are we going to see that in the next couple of years?
I'm an expansion proponent. I'll tell you really for the reason that a 32-team league with some tolerance for realignment could really help us from a schedule format perspective. 32s, 32 goes into 4. 4s work way better in a schedule than 5s, which is what we have now. But equally important, and you actually saw it last year in our television ratings, the rating days that are difficult for us are those 4-game days, right, where we hit in the division series. And why is it hard? We need 4 windows. And what can happen in our current format is, you need a 9:30, maybe even a 10 o'clock game on a day. Well, often that game is being played in Anaheim, and you say, okay, that's great. So 10 o'clock Eastern, you're playing at 7 o'clock in Anaheim, that's all good. Well, yeah, that's all good except if they're playing the Red Sox, right? So if you could get yourself more geographically aligned this year, really easy for us because we had Arizona, LA, West Coast teams where we had matchups that we could put in that 10 o'clock slot. It was good for everybody.
Right.
Good for everybody. So,
where are you expanding? Where would we go?
Oh, look, we're fortunate. There's places that are viable and want Major League Baseball. Montreal would desperately like to have a team back. I'd like to, if we were going to do it, I'd like to look at an international possibility, whether it's Canada, Mexico, wherever. I think that would be good for the game in terms of the internationalization of the sport. I think the catch right now is we need to get Tampa and Oakland.
That was where we were going next.
Yeah, I mean, we need to get Tampa and Oakland squared away before we do. And I want to be in Oakland. I think, 10 years from now, I think we're going to be very glad that we toughed it out, figured out a way to make it work in Oakland, because I think with the right facility, Oakland could be really, really successful. Same thing with Florida. I mean, everybody knows about the demographic trends in terms of people moving to Florida, and I think it's really important for us to make a success of those 2 franchises.
All right, so you said 10 years in Oakland. Do you see it in Tampa Bay in 10 years or somewhere else in Florida?
No, I think I'm equally bullish on Tampa Bay. Yeah, I really am. I think that it's there's enough there in terms of media market. We need to get a facility that's located in a way that can take advantage of the entire Tampa Bay area. And by that I mean St. Pete, Tampa. And, hats off to the governments there, and it really is separate governmental entities. Instead of saying, I'm the mayor of St. Pete and it's got to be in St. Pete, they said, look, we want baseball in the Tampa Bay region. Right? So let's find the place that works and makes baseball work in the Tampa Bay region.
Playoff expansion?
I like where we are. I really do like where we are in the playoffs. I think the 1-game play-in was really positive. It really kicks us off in the postseason with exciting knockout games right at the beginning. I think it has really helped the end of our regular season because, believe me, everybody plays hard to avoid being in that knockout game. Nobody likes the idea of having to play those games, and that's really good.
They shouldn't.
Right, and that's really important in terms of making September relevant. I think that it is appropriate for the division winner to have an advantage in the postseason as opposed to somebody who gets in as a wild card.
What if we had 2 81-game seasons so that sometime in the end of June became really exciting for several other teams?
We've thought about split seasons and talked about them internally. I think that they work better in a 32-team format, to tell you the truth. There are some real limitations as long as we're 15-15 in terms of making that work.
DH in one league continues, both leagues, neither league.
I think we stay where we are. I actually think it's a good thing. It's endless. So if you ever get bored and run out of a question to raise with somebody, you can ask about the DH, because everybody.
I ain't bored. I'm not bored.
You know, it's only 2 minutes left, right? Whatever. You know, I think that it is actually a good source of conversation among our fans, and it's something we should not discard easily. I also think it is the remaining source of league identity, right? And leagues are really important to us from a competitive perspective. We play up through leagues, and you know what differentiates, you know, the St. Louis Cardinals from the New York Yankees? Well, one plays with a DH and the other doesn't.
Right.
I mean, that's really important.
Along those lines, then, the 32, does that, like, are we married to Interleague for the foreseeable future? Has it run its course?
Yeah, no, look, I think Interleague plays a good thing in terms of fans having an opportunity in their home markets to see the greatest players in the game. And, you know, it's not as frequent as some would like, but, you know, there is that opportunity. I will say this about Interleague play. I liked the segments that we used to do before when we were 16, 14. I think it was an exciting spot in the schedule. Obviously, you lose that when you have to do it when you go to 15-15 and you have to play every day.
Right. 25-man rosters. A lot of people think that we should be doing it the other way, like
Yeah.
backwards. We're backwards now.
Doing it, having a larger
Yes.
roster. Yeah, look, honestly, we thought we had a deal with the Players Association on a larger roster as part of this last basic agreement, and it came apart really on their side of the table. One thing we're good about, if we get to a deal, we kind of stay put. But, you know, for some reason, that one did not hold together, and it was player issues. We don't even really know.
Right.
Ordinarily, you would think more jobs. You know,
When you're really bored, you go to the Pete Rose question.
Yeah.
We have 27 seconds left. What's the Pete Rose solution?
Look, I think that this sounds like I'm going to duck.
If you're really quiet for 18 seconds, the
Yeah, I
buzzer
can
will
just
go
avoid
out.
it. I really do believe the Pete Rose answer has to come from the Hall of Fame, right? And why do I believe that? I believe that because I became convinced in the course of our review that Pete should not be allowed to participate actively in our game because he has a propensity to bet on our game, and I think that can affect the integrity. Those same concerns, I don't think should determine whether or not your name goes on a ballot or you can be considered by a committee and go into the Hall of Fame. I see those issues differently. The Hall of Fame so far has not agreed with me on that.
Right.
I've been pretty public about it, and so far, you know, they're in a different place. We don't run the Hall of Fame, so, you know.
Some people actually think you do.
Well, I
you don't.
realize that, but we don't.
All right, so this is great. I pick up the iPad and I figure, like, this is going to be a disaster because these are the questions from the folks, but it's MIT. Right away, the questions are in front of me.
I'm sorry.
It worked out beautifully.
Okay.
I was a little leery of this whole thing. How much do you think the new mound visit rule will result in better offensive production for teams?
Oh, that's a tough one. That is really a tough one. I don't think that it's going to have a material impact on the way the game is played in terms of favoring offense over pitchers. I think that there are plenty of opportunities in our game for wisdom from the coaching staff to be imparted to pitchers, and that you won't see a real big change.
But they will figure out another way to kind of slow it down and send signals. We see it in college baseball all the time. It's a disaster.
Look, I think that what you hope for, and, you know, it's a big experiment, right, is net what you pick up by limiting the mound visits in terms of save time is greater than whatever new form of communication emerges.
You mentioned replays take an average of 50 seconds per game. Is there data for how much time the managers previously spent arguing calls?
You know what? I have to say, I think we do actually have data on arguments that we collected over a period of years. I would be hard-pressed to give you any accurate recounting.
I miss a little bit of that. I do miss the argument. I miss the angry manager. I mean, that was one of those things that baseball provided.
Look, I think that whenever you make a change, you run the risk that you're going to lose some human element in the game. that people are attracted to, and that's certainly one.
Yeah. Can you comment on the development of Major League Baseball in China?
Yeah, China's been a country where we have focused extensively. We actually run 2 wall-to-wall academies, and by wall-to-wall I mean we provide education to kids and they play baseball at the same time. We have a full-time staff in both of those schools. We have made a pretty significant investment. By that I mean in terms of making content available without really making any money. In China, we had a great program that we did in conjunction with the Chinese government where the World Series was actually shown in schools during school time throughout the World Series. And it will be a continued area of focus for us. One of the things we're talking about is most all of the activity to date has been done centrally. We've actually had conversations about turning individual clubs loose to do more in China.
Really? Yeah. This is a great question. Do you foresee a point where shifts in defensive alignment will be regulated?
Can I tell you, you've heard me tell this story before. You tricked me.
That was not a trick.
It was a trick.
It's a question.
In the first interview I did after I actually took over as commissioner was with Carl. And he kept, one of the things in the media training I had done, saying, you should avoid speculating about changes to the game because people get all worked up about it. So Carl keeps after me, what would you change? What would you change? He must have asked me 20 times. I finally said, look, I don't love these defensive shifts. Oh my God. Probably some of the authors are here in the audience, but people literally sent me papers, typed manuscripts, 25, 30 pages by email. They had footnotes, the whole thing, about how wrong I was about wanting to outlaw defensive shifts.
I think I used the word radical, and I think you just said, okay, well, listen,
here's
I don't like it.
It's interesting. We've actually heard some rumblings on this topic from players. That shifting has actually altered the game in ways that they don't love. So, maybe that's one of those topics where we will find
mostly offensive players.
Yeah, well, mostly offensive players, but, not unusual. And I think actually the roster size issue that you mentioned before, it's not unusual within the player bargaining unit that pitchers and position players go opposite directions on-field topics.
All right, we're being waved off. Obama went a little deep. One quick question.
Sure.
Automated strike zone, or do you ever see like home plate umpires being replaced by computers? And I think it's really the automated strike zone.
Yeah, look, I think that right now, the state of the technology is that in real time, okay, and in real time, the technology is not accurate enough to call balls and strikes in a game. Sooner or later, it's going to get there. At that point in time, I think it gets back to the argument kind of question. Do you really want to change the game by taking that human element out of ball strike calls? And, I would suggest to you that among the things you need to think about is the home plate umpire runs the game. But he runs the game with authority because he controls balls and strikes. Right? You really got to think that one through.
We need video game. Well, audience, automated strike zone by clapping, yes or no? And then no by clapping.
I like that group. I like
Guy in red, you clapped a lot louder for no.
Yeah.
I saw you. Thank you guys very much. Rob Manfred, Commissioner of Major League Baseball.